The world is increasingly interconnected and technology is accelerating the process. But the question really is whether an interconnected world can solve the challenges we all share. Are we going to have collective answers? How can a global village become a united front? To answer those questions, in this edition of Wu Talk, a World Insight special on the World Internet Conference in Wuzhen, we're joined by Fabrizio Hochschild Drummond, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, and Alois Zwinggi, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, and Margit Molnar, China Chief Economist at the OECD, and Lu Qi, Founding CEO of the MiraclePlus YC China, and Eric Jing, Partner and Board Member of Alibaba Group and also Chairman and CEO of Ant Financial Services Group.
Mr. Undersecretary General, it's not the first time that I saw you in Beijing or in China. But how is that report going on, trying to bring everybody together for some common consensus about the Internet and global governance of the Internet?
It's going well. As you said, the Secretary General commissioned a high-level panel that was co-led by Jack Ma. We were very fortunate. And Melinda Gates, and brought 20 other leaders in this domain from around the world together to look at how we cooperate better across the world to steer the Internet, to make it truly a tool for good, a tool for advancement, a tool for human rights, a tool for development, and contain some of the unintended consequences and malicious uses. We're now in the follow-up stage. We're building multi-stakeholder coalitions around the recommendations, and there's a certain amount of progress, but some of the current geopolitics don't make it easy.
Well, the World Economic Forum is a platform rather to bring all the players together. Mr. Zwinggi, I'm sure you have your version of what are the most pressing issues.
I think one of the challenges that we see today as we study this is sort of the question, do we have actually the governance on the public side as well as on the private side to deal with this? And I think the fact is that these technological advances that we see right now are somehow sort of overwhelming leaders and decision makers to act with the speed that is required to come up with the new rules of the game.
Do you feel the same, Ms. Molnar?
I think the most important is to strike the right way, several balances. And one of those balances to be struck is the balance between efficiency and risk. How to make use of the efficiency that the new technologies can offer, at the same time while controlling for the risks. Those risks involve a large range of risks. For instance, concentration that can lead to anti-competitive behavior. Then risk can also involve fraud. It can also involve consumer protection, so need to enhance consumer protection. So that's one of the balances that needs to be struck. Then the other balance is that we need to provide everything, all the ingredients that are needed to make use of technologies. We have made empirical research on complementarities between technologies and skills. And we found that these complementarities are very strong.
Well, we got some of the policymakers and also academic voices. What about the practitioners? I mean, these two gentlemen sitting on the stage are coming from the private sector. Mr. Lu, you want to go first? Pressing question for you.
I think the pressing issues are several-fold. The primary one is, in the new era, we call it AI, whereby the main productive capital isn't writing software anymore. It's actually using data to train algorithms. And the fact that we benefit from open source software over the last several decades, how can we work together globally to create a new mechanism, just like the old days open source software, so that more data, while their privacy and economic value can be fully protected, but they can be harnessed together so that engineers from different parts of the economy can leverage each individual's advances, use those as they work on different types of innovations, particularly, as I mentioned, my recent focus is really in the early stage, particularly when companies are very young.
Yeah.
We want to really lower the barrier for them. So through that lens, that's the pressing issue. How can we lower the barrier of innovations for entrepreneurs?
Are you trying to suggest there needs to be more data sharing in certain kinds of format, and therefore it could benefit the business world, particularly the new entrepreneurs? They can have lower entry point and also have more space to explore. Is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely. If you write code, I tell them code. We have open source software. They essentially write little code, you can get an application done. Now you have to have all the data yourself, whether you want to do something speech, computer vision based, automation in factories. We want to make sure that we collectively work together, create a new mechanism on global community so that entrepreneurs across the world, they have lowered the barrier.
Okay, Mr. Jing, of course, you have a lot of data in a way, and finance has been developing very fast here in China and in the developing world as well. But I guess your point is not just about the data, it's about the convenience to the people. But I want to ask you also about the pressing question you consider.
From my perspective, I think, how can we using technology, and collaborate to bring an inclusive world for all, leaving no one behind? That's the most critical question. So I take Ant Financial as an example. So Ant Financial is a tech company. We are dedicated using technology and innovation to provide financial inclusion to the underserved and unserved individuals and SMEs. So today you can see that even at the foot of Himalaya mountain, the people there, living there, can also using mobile pay, just like people do in Beijing and Shanghai. That's a huge, enormous change. And secondly, talk about SME financing. So we have a subsidiary we call the My Bank. It's online banking. So we using data and to come up with credit profiling to providing puny credit loans to SMEs starting from 2010. So almost 10 years. So far already providing uncollateralized loan to over 90 million SMEs. So that's huge. So you see the technology and it's really a very effective way to address that challenge, SME financing, to really make it scalable and sustainable. So, and most importantly, even with already 19 million SMEs in China, but in China looking at overall, there's about 100 million SMEs. So how we can collaborate with more partners to making sure every SME they got and they can access to the financing easily. That's the biggest challenge. So we're looking forward, maybe next 3 years, we can, by working together, making sure every SMEs across China, anytime they need financing, they can get access to it.
Mr. Undersecretary General, obviously you can see the two entrepreneurs are very passionate about all the changes it could bring, but at the same time, scratching to look for new ways of make use of the best resource that they can for their customers, the public. Mr. Undersecretary General, I know there are a lot of solutions that in the report you and your colleagues are trying to design. Under the current circumstances, is it easy to do?
Well, the short answer is no, but I think the uniqueness of the digital technology is that the drive forward has almost been exclusively driven by business and to some extent academia. And the policymakers, whether in government or in the international organizations like my own, are way behind and desperately trying to play catch up. And that has all sorts of problems. That means that there are all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, Mr. Wolf alluded to the problems of social media. The effects on youth, we've seen elsewhere, the effects on politics, the echo chambers, the fragmentation, the spread of hate speech. So there are all sorts of problems that are arising, I think, frankly, because policymakers have stayed behind. So what we need to do now...
The policymakers throughout history have always been staying behind.
No, but I don't...
So what's the difference this time?
If you permit me, I disagree. In the case of the other big technological jumps forward in our time, many of them have been in the hands of government. I mean, nuclear technology was very much spurned by national government. Space exploration We heard the quote of President Kennedy around moon exploration was spurred by national government. So it was very much aligned with policies. In the case of nuclear technology, the policymakers came in very quickly to regulate, to guide it for the good use and to contain the bad use. In the case of digital technology, it's also spread faster than any other technology in the world. I mean, that is true. Policymakers tend to be slow, business tends to be fast, and that gap is nowhere bigger than when it comes to digital technology.
Since you are already using several analogies, let me repeat just one of those analogies. Nuclear, for example. It was only until there was an explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that people see the human disaster that technology created, that there is a very connected world to try to come up with a solution with it. The question really is, Mr. Zwinggi, do we have to experience that kind of human tragedy in order to be able to do what every one of you, ladies and gentlemen on the stage, have been calling out to do?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, that I think is a very clear answer. I mean, to some degree, it's really encouraging to see how the entrepreneurs here on the stage see these opportunities, and see the opportunities, obviously, for their businesses as well, for the communities and the societies. I think it's useful also to recognize that globally, only about half of the world's population today has access to internet. So how do we ensure, actually, that the other half has the opportunity also to catch up, which on the one hand, I think we owe it as a society, as a community, to that other half, so that we don't have this divide. On the other hand, also, it increases the opportunity for businesses. And I think there's a couple of things that countries or communities could think about to make that happen. Digital IDs could be one area. We know that India has been working on this quite intensely to also make sure that people have actually access to financial services, health services. Obviously, that brings a whole range of other challenges with it, who protects that individual data. But I also think there is a responsibility here for the private sector to think also around opportunities, how to bridge that digital divide to some degree. And maybe one thought there is lifelong learning. So how do businesses actually make sure that their employees get trained and can learn how to deal with those changes, because it will benefit them from an employer point of view, but it will also benefit them as members of society.
You're watching Wu Talk from the World Internet Conference. We'll be back after this.
The Internet is celebrating its 50th birthday, having been nurturing an interconnected world. Accomplishing its future missions are not without challenge. CGTN joins hands with the World Internet Conference to present you Wu Talk. What is the future of the Internet? And what is our future with the Internet? Not only a trip back in history with thinkers, movers, and shakers, but one journey into the future with all of you.
In this episode of Travelogue, I journey to the far reaches of Inner Mongolia, where I attempt to master the art of raising camels. Along the way, I discover just how important camels continue to be for the survival of the people living in this desert region.
Since you talk about how to benefit the public, I know once again I have to come back to you because Mr. Jing, you've been talking about it earlier in your answer. But what is the next stage? Now you have the preliminary stage already done. What is the next stage that Mr. Undersecretary General has been talking about, and also from the World Economic Forum's observation? What is the next step you think you can proceed to bridge the digital gap, as you said, and also be able to create a more secured space that people feel they can be part of?
You know, they're talking about geographic gap, you know, in China. You know, I mean, actually there's a line, an imaginary line, across China. It stretches from the northeast, from Heihe to the southwest in Tengchong city. Basically, that line divides China into two roughly equally two parts. But the two parts have a very big gap in terms of their population density and also their economic development. But that idea was discovered the first time by Mr. Hu Huanyong, you know, back in 1935. Over the last century, even with the China, you know, with their, I mean, their government and all their efforts were being put in places, but not that gap not changed too much. But interestingly, in this century, over the last 1 decade, I mean, that line is gradually disappearing. You know, so recently, a research report by the Peking University found out that the gap between the two parts, I mean, the gap is narrowing, definitely narrowing significantly because of digital technology. So basically, the western part of China, those people, they can participate in more economic activities by leveraging the digital marketplaces. They can access to the capital through the digital financial serving, right? So all these people, they got support, access to the market, access to the capital. There's a huge difference. So that's first story. Second story about maybe using another cases about a demographic gap. So interestingly, also by the Peking University, that research report, they mentioned that the elderly, the old people, right now they are, I mean, ramping up using more kind of the digital ways to communicate or to get access to their financial support.
Yes.
So that's really thanks to a couple of efforts. Number one, from the government side. The government side really can, number one, spend huge efforts building the infrastructure. Secondly, put a lot of focus on safeguarding protecting the consumers. And on the consumer public sector, people also have a lot of efforts. So to keep improving the experience, making sure that interface, that consumer journey is smoothness, is hassle-free. So because of its joint efforts, right now, even the elderly people, their adoption rate of internet much higher.
Is China's case study, as beautifully as Mr. Jing illustrated, applicable also elsewhere in the world? Because after all, many countries, different systems, the way they do things. And also, it is not just about how to within a country, but rather how to interact among countries and among different players. Ms. Molnar.
Well, unfortunately, digitalization has only exacerbated the divide, the income divide, and also the divide between different groups in the society. I'm very surprised to hear from Mr. Jin that in China there are some indicators which show a narrowing of this divide, because so far what I have seen just showed the opposite. No matter whether you look at the smart manufacturing or the internet users, at least according to official data, that there is a wide gap according to the income gap. So whatever you would...
You mean OECD countries?
China.
Oh, okay.
So it's good to see that there are some indicators, especially more recent research that points to the opposite direction. And what explains this divide, when looking at the details, is about half is explained by a lack of computer literacy. So people are not using the internet, mainly because they can't use the computer.
What about in OECD countries? Because it's a very different group, a very inclusive group, rather. So what about that? Do you have some also data?
Yes, I mean, the skill biotechnological change has been a very famous reason behind increasing inequalities. And the evidence is not that straightforward, especially when looking at empirical work. But if just looking at simple data, you can easily identify.
Mr. Lu, Ms. Molnar always emphasizing on the growth of the government. Do you think that is the way?
So I've been listening to my panelists. Some of what they said really resonates. In my previous job at Microsoft, I was doing office business, search engine business, talked to a lot of regulators, well-educated, well-intended people, but they are behind. I very much see that because the technology has complexity and also it's really moving fast, have deeper and deeper societal impact. I think it takes, my view is, it takes a collective effort. There will be the the undersecretary on the global level and the World Economic Forum level at the national level. But I think the private sector needs to step up a lot more, particularly the founders of the executives of the companies running large digital platforms. They need to be deeply mindful about their platforms, its penetrating impact to people's life. What I urge the founders to do is essentially be on the right side. Don't wait for the regulatory bodies. Do the right thing. Because in many cases, you know, these are not necessarily the right thing to do. Profits, growth are important, but enabling people to have genuine access to information, equal opportunities, these are the things we want the founders to hold dear. So that through a better private side, better founders, better executives, and coupled with all the better policies, I think that's the collective way we can move gradually towards a better future.
Can we rely on the good intentions of human nature in a way to call on the executive to do what Mr. Liu mentioned to many of the friends that he had in China? Mr. Undersecretary General, is that the way to go? Because we really need some solution. We know what needs to be done, but the question is how to do it, Mr. Undersecretary General.
I think many speakers have made the point that technology is value neutral. It can be used for the good, it can be used for the bad.
Yeah.
I would add to that that technology also often brings unintended consequences. It's not just a question of how it's used, it's a question of its impact. And we've seen many unintended impacts of social media. So it needs a public steer. It needs a public steer to stop malicious use, exploitation of children, for example, through the internet, and to contain unintended consequences. And those steers need to happen internationally, because this technology, by definition, reduces distances to zero, ignores borders largely, and to try and create borders in cyberspace is tremendously expensive and ultimately futile. So we need to come together as an international community, and not just states, because business is at the heart, at the lead of this technology. For the most part, governments are playing catch-up. So we need to come together across the world between business, government, and civil society and come up with a common set of principles that recognize differences between countries, differences in political attitudes, differences in attitudes towards privacy, but have enough common elements to allow this to be global. The traditional fact that you have so many divisions, you know, business people do business, government people do policy, they don't really talk enough to each other, that you have geopolitical divisions. Those divisions don't help when we need interconnected solutions.
Yeah. Artificial intelligence, I want to press a little bit more because you really need to give some specific examples, Mr. Undersecretary General. That has been, you know, everybody embrace it, but at the same time, everybody knows its side effect as well. So about that specific issue, we can use that as a case study. How are you, and with that report, specifically some solutions to the side effects?
Let me give you a very concrete example. Artificial intelligence, social media platforms use artificial intelligence, use algorithms to amplify content, to retransmit content to people who they think are interested users.
Yes.
So when the Christchurch attack happened, this was the attack where somebody live-streamed a mass murder in a mosque. That live streaming through the artificial intelligence, through algorithms by the social media companies, was automatically retransmitted to literally millions of users without any human agency involved. And that's what social media does. It provides an echo chamber through algorithms, through AI, to what it believes are your views, which has a very fragmenting approach on society. Following that attack, the big social media companies came together and came up with a certain set of agreements on how to better contain and provide, through human intervention, a stop to where those algorithms, those AI applications, are in essence having a negative effect. Last week, or the week before, there was a neo-Nazi attack against a synagogue in Germany, and some people were killed. That was also live streamed. In that case, the live stream application reached 3,000 people as opposed to millions, thanks to sort of interventions. So this is where policymakers and business have to come together and find solutions, and the technology can't be just left to run on its own.
Incidents like this led to solutions with a lot of process of negotiation, discussion, but the urgency is always there. Even small thing as this, social media algorithm about which message to push to you takes so much effort. Mr. Zwinggi, it's mind-boggling for me to think about all the areas that we really need to cover over here.
Yeah, let me go back to the social divide or the digital divide.
And you're going to come back to this question, right?
Actually, as I'm not an expert on AI, I'd rather not talk
I'll
about
let
AI.
your neighbor, Mr. Liu, to handle that later. Yep, go ahead.
So what I wanted to share is sort of an example how Switzerland is dealing with this digital divide story. And, you know, the World Economic Forum is at home in Switzerland. Switzerland, about 3 years ago, created an initiative. It was private sector-led, called Digital Switzerland. And it had as its purpose to support the digitization of the country and actually to bring sort of the maybe more technological or sort of high-level concerns about technological development to the people, to the citizens. And it was private sector-led. However, from the beginning, it started to involve government. So it ended being a public-private partnership after year one. And what I found astonishing, that the key focus area in year 3, which we are now, is actually on lifelong learning. It seems like a very sort of simple and not technological focus, but I think it's so important that you know, we bridge what's happening sort of on a technological sphere to everybody's daily life. And it has amassed, I mean, Switzerland is a small place, you know, we only have 7 million people. But within literally 2-3 months, it assembled more than 200 companies and organizations actually to embrace that lifelong learning initiative. So that's what I wanted to sort of share as an example how we deal with this. So I leave now the AI topic to experts.
Thank you for that very lively example.
The Internet is celebrating its 50th birthday, having been nurturing an interconnected world. Accomplishing its future missions are not without challenge. CGTN joins hands with the World Internet Conference to present you WuTalk. What is the future of the Internet? And what is our future with the Internet? Not only a trip back in history with thinkers, movers, and shakers, but one journey into the future with all of you.
Mr. Liu, come back to you about what Mr. Fabrizio was talking about, the AI thing. That's very literally a challenge in front of us, but at the same time, everybody benefit from it. So how do you take it from what Mr. Undersecretary's argument is?
Yeah, so today's general AI technology, fundamentally human plays a role there because the algorithms are trained by data and the labeled data. Meaning that when you train a recommendation algorithm, so what content to recommend, there's human editorial voices that are involved. That's number one. Number two, operationally, I do think there needs to be some human oversight for things that are of unexpected natures. Having said all that, I think there's a couple of things we can make it more efficient. One is always improving tools and processes so that we can make these decisions faster. The second is I do think for a private company, I've been thinking about that, talking to many friends for a while, we need to come up with sort of overall a governance model. When you make an editorial decision, the right stakeholders are ideally participating. Because when you say this article is pro the left-leaning side of the political voices, and then who is to say this editorial judgment is correct? Is the company to make that call, or is somebody else to make that call? I do think there's good dialogue to be had. Again, in the spirit of collectively working towards tools, processes, governance models that overall we can manage that phenomenon better.
Mr. Undersecretary General, also this question, we need to go deeper about that. Do you think those could be the solutions? What is preventing us from doing what Mr. Lu beautifully described just now?
Well, let me give you a concrete example. Somebody from a very, very major social media platform told me the other day that he went to the European Parliament to explain what measures, what internal regulations his company was taking to stop interference in a regional election. That is the world on its head. I mean, it should have been the European Parliament explaining to the company what regulations they needed to take in order to stop interference in an election, and not the other way around. So we're seeing this as a default position in many countries, where companies, in the absence of regulations, are inventing their own regulations without the same accountability, public accountability, as parliaments. I mean, I spoke to a major corporation in Japan, and I asked them who work on internet, work with data, work with a lot of data, what policies they follow, privacy policies they use to regulate data in their work in Asia. And they say, well, in the Japanese market, we follow Japanese regulation. And in China, we follow China regulation. And in country X, Y, and Z that don't have any regulation, we follow our own. And this is the problem. By default, in the absence of public regulation, companies are adopting their own, which of course is much better than nothing.
But on the other hand, people would counter-argue that there are also companies being accused of violating people's privacy, of taking advantage of a lack of regulations. So how do you see this very mixed picture?
Well, I think those violations happen in the absence of sufficient public policy safeguards.
Yes.
So I think the blame is not so much on the companies, although I'm sure companies many times have done wrong. I'm not trying to say that. But I think it shouldn't be for a call. The call is for public policy makers to do more, so that companies aren't left exposed and on their own in that space. So where the catch-up needs to happen is in the public policy space. But it has to happen in a smart way. I would agree with other speakers in that regard.
So are you trying to tell your members, Ms. Molnar, the members of OECD countries, that the governments really need to learn, please catch up, do not be slow anymore, the world is moving on?
To most of our members, yes. Well, the governments need to catch up, and they need to steer standards and rules so that new technologies will not lead to mistrust. But I'm happy to announce that not all, that's why I said most, because there are some governments that are very much ahead and that are leading the whole process. One of such governments is that of Estonia. That's one of the countries that I'm covering. And the government is way ahead than other governments, and then also compared to the business sector. Just a few examples. E-government is probably among the top 3 or top 5, depending on which indicators in the world. You can do everything, every matter that you would need to do with the government online, except 3 things. You cannot get married online, you cannot get divorced online, and you cannot sell real estate online. But except those 3 things, you can do everything online. And it is the government who created this environment. So that is good news that it's possible. And also in AI, there are pioneers. They will come out with the first draft of the AI law next June. Right now, they are working on it. The 2 contentious issues are accountability and supervision.
It's very interesting, these case studies, successful ones. I want to ask the question from the other way around. The policies need to be designed to leave space for business to grow, to also leave space for innovation to happen. Mr. Jing, As an entrepreneur and a business person from China, one of the fastest developing country in the world, how do you see that space? What can be done to create that space?
So first of all, if we are looking at our journey of Ant Financial, how we can go to business from scratch to today, I really would like to give credit to the regulators. So without, they put in place their enabling policy and the guiding policy framework, we cannot go to where we are today. But secondly, around 90% of the population are in the emerging markets. So inclusive development, champion for the inclusive development still should be the main focus for everyone. So by saying that, it's really public sector, private sector should work really together to kind of using the technology and the digital technology to really moving the agenda forward. From public sector perspectives, I think it definitely should be open-minded from the future thinking to looking at the policy framework, number one. Secondly, I think today, the regulators also should kind of using, tech to help them to, so-called RegTech, to help them to enhance the ability. So basically, with the tech, you can really see through, right? Can have overall comprehensive view of what's happening and a real-time view on that. That's really kind of enhance the capability of doing that. Certainly, it's also important. Sandbox type of mechanism is also very critical. This type of things really can, if you're small, put in a sandbox, you can have pilot, have try. Then, after that, you can see some experimental results that can further rolling out. And this type of things are very critical.
The space for the entrepreneurs to explore, for scientists to take advantage of, for the public to see the potential they could still have, even though they haven't imagined it. What about that space in terms of policy making?
I think the great risk of our times, if I can go back to the global, is that we're going to end up with what the Secretary General a few weeks ago at the General Assembly called the great fracture. The world once again splitting into 2 or 3 main poles with separate internet systems, separate AI systems, separate political systems, separate business models. And the only way to prevent that is to try and build the foundation of common understanding. And I think the business community has a major role to play in that, because I suspect there's much more pragmatic understanding among the business community across the continents than there is among the politicians. So I think the businessmen have to also raise to the challenge of our times, which is to counteract that. And I think politicians, national governments need to come together better to try and resist this, because that is the way we're drifting at the moment.
We never imagined at this time of so much interconnectedness. We have a world of extreme uncertainty. So what does that mean for everybody when we are trying to look for the solutions of the questions which you raised earlier through the past 40 minutes? What does it mean? What is the solution? Let's go with, sir, you go first, and we go in this direction.
Look, I think we're not in more uncertain times than in the past. Maybe it just feels like that because we have just more media exposure to this. Clearly,
I hope that is the case.
Clearly, I think, we from the World Economic Forum believe strongly in multi-stakeholder platforms. In a sense, let's not be guarded or guided by mistrust, but actually, let's have the courage of reaching across the aisle and have conversations across different stakeholder groups.
Conversations.
Discussions. If it leads to outcomes, great. Maybe it needs a second iteration. Okay,
Mr. Jing.
I think, I know, as we know, UN have a very tremendous kind of agenda, SDGs by 2030, right? All about for sustainable development. So I think the inclusive development should be the focus for everyone. Should be the common task for common mission for everyone. So how we can, so no development is the biggest risk. We should not lose the future in the worries. So we should, really kind of take actions using technology and collaborate for a better world, for inclusive world. That's very critical.
Ms. Molnar?
I think coordination is the most important, collaboration, coordination. Already mentioned before, the setting of standards and rules is important. And also it's important to identify which are the areas that must be regulated and which are the ones where self-regulation also works.
Mr. Liu?
Well, we embrace all those. The solution is to let the software be all together, GitHub, because you look at everything we're talking about, they're all being created by the software. As long as the world of developers are using a common platforms, open software, sharing, and if I would add one more, is let the entrepreneurs of the world, because they are the ones are building the future.
Okay, software as entrepreneurs, I got the key words. Would that work, Fabrizio?
I think we are in times of extreme uncertainty. I think our grandparents, our parents knew roughly what sort of world we would live in. I think we have very little idea what world our grandchildren will live in. I think the uncertainties generated by climate change, the uncertainties generated by a technological revolution of unknown reach means that we have more uncertainty than ever. I think we need a compass. I think the international agreements that exist provide a compass. I think the international norms, the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the SDGs provide a compass. But above all, I think we need dialogue. Dialogue between countries and dialogue between stakeholder groups. And one of the great ironies and contradictions of the internet is while it's connected more people than ever, in some ways it's undermined dialogue more than ever.
Well, if we can say many of the mechanisms we have in today's world, the internet, virtual reality, 50 years. The United Nations next year, 75 years. Not long in terms of human history at all. But at least, ladies and gentlemen, when we see the challenges facing our world today, we are already gathering around and trying to work so hard to come up with some solutions, at least from today. So I want to thank all of you for being with us for this panel and thinking hard, even here, right here, for solutions. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for being with us. And this is Wu Talk from the World Internet Conference.